Welcome back to Nightfall Notions, where the stories are just boring enough to lull you into a restless slumber. If you enjoy tales of historical misery wrapped in dry humor, consider subscribing for more content that's as comforting as a lumpy straw mattress. Tonight's chapter delves into the dubious honor of being a medieval jester, a role that was equal parts entertainer and human punching bag. Chapter 1. The Jester's Dubious Honor. To the untrained eye, the life of a medieval jester might have seemed enviable. Clad in motley, bells jingling with every step, he was the only man in the castle legally permitted to mock the king to his face. Or so the legends would have you believe. The reality, of course, was far less glamorous. The jester's existence was a tightrope walk between laughter and lashings, a precarious dance where one misstep could mean the difference between a gold coin and a night in the stocks. Consider the hiring process. Most jesters weren't plucked from the ranks of the naturally witty or theatrically gifted. No, they were often the misfits, the oddballs, the men and women too strange to fit into any other role in society. Some were former minstrels who'd failed to charm audiences with their ballads. Others were peasants with a knack for tumbling, sold off by their families in exchange for a few sacks of grain. A rare few were even prisoners of war, spared execution only because the local lord found their foreign accent amusing. The jester's cap, then, was less a crown of merriment and more a badge of survival. Once installed in the castle, the jester's duties were deceptively simple: entertain. But what did that mean exactly? On good days, it might involve juggling, singing bawdy songs, or performing slapstick routines where the punchline was usually the jester himself taking a pratfall. On bad days, it meant being the verbal whipping boy for a room full of drunk nobles who'd just as soon throw a goblet at your head as laugh at your jokes. The line between amusement and offense was thinner than the soup served in the peasant quarters, and crossing it was perilously easy. Take, for example, the case of Roland the Unfortunate, a jester in the court of Duke Henri of Burgundy. Roland had a particular talent for mimicry, and for months he delighted the court by imitating the duke's pompous walk and the way he snorted when he laughed. The duke, in a rare good mood, even rewarded Roland with a silver chain for his efforts. But one evening, after one too many cups of wine, Roland made the mistake of mimicking the duke's new bride, a woman famously sensitive about her protruding chin. The laughter that followed was not the kind Roland wanted. The duke's face darkened, and before Roland could so much as stammer an apology, he was dragged to the courtyard and forced to wear a donkey's head for a week as punishment. And then there were the physical hazards. Jesters were expected to perform acrobatics, often on demand, regardless of whether they'd eaten that day or were nursing a fresh bruise from the last performance. A missed catch during a juggling act could mean a broken nose. A poorly executed somersault might earn a boot to the ribs from an unimpressed knight. Even the jester's iconic costume was a liability. Those dangling bells made it impossible to sneak away when the mood of the room turned sour. Perhaps the cruelest irony of the jester's life was that his very purpose, to lighten the mood, often made him the target of the court's collective frustration. When the harvest failed, when the taxes went unpaid, when the duke's hunting dogs died of mysterious causes, the jester was a convenient scapegoat. After all, who better to blame than the fool who'd been cracking jokes all along? It was a role that demanded endless resilience, a thick skin, and the ability to laugh along when the joke was, invariably, on you. So the next time you imagine the life of a medieval jester, picture not the grinning fool of storybooks, but a man or woman perched on the edge of disaster, smiling through gritted teeth, knowing that today's laughter could be tomorrow's lashing. The honor was dubious indeed. Chapter 2. The Royal Court's Whipping Boy. If there was one thing the jester understood better than anyone in the castle, it was the weight of unspoken rules. The nobles could pretend all they liked that their world ran on chivalry and decorum, but the truth was far messier. Every smile in the royal court was a calculation, every laugh a carefully measured release of tension. And when that tension needed somewhere to go, the jester was always there to catch it. Take, for instance, the matter of royal moods. A king in a foul temper could not very well strike his advisers. They were too valuable, too well connected. His wife was often untouchable, protected by politics or the threat of her family's retaliation. Even the servants knew better than to linger too close when the storm clouds gathered over the throne. But the jester? The jester was fair game. This was not an accident. The jester's position was designed to absorb the court's collective bad humor, to serve as a lightning rod for frustrations that might otherwise spark rebellion. A well-timed insult hurled at the fool could diffuse a noble's simmering rage. A mock beating performed for laughs could remind everyone in the room where the real power lay. The jester's job was to make it look like play, even when it wasn't. Consider the case of Perrin, jester to King Alaric the Surly. Perrin was a small man with a face like a half-chewed apple and a voice that could mimic anything from a war horn to a dying goose. For 3 years he had survived the court by being just offensive enough to amuse, but never so offensive that he couldn't talk his way out of trouble. Then came the winter of the great grain shortage, when the king's stores ran low and the people began to murmur. It started subtly. A noble would accidentally trip Perrin as he passed, sending him sprawling to the laughter of the hall. A lady might flick wine in his face and pretend it was a jest. Then, as the king's mood worsened, so did the treatment. One evening, after a particularly disastrous hunt, the king himself ordered Perrin to stand in the center of the hall, while the court took turns pelting him with bread rolls. It was supposed to be funny. And maybe it was, at first. But by the 20th roll, the laughter had taken on an edge, and Perrin's smile had gone stiff as old leather. The worst part was that he couldn't even complain. To protest would be to admit he didn't understand the game, and that was the one sin a jester could never commit. The moment he showed pain, the moment he let the mask slip, he was no longer a jester, he was just a victim. And victims didn't last long in castles. Physical abuse was only half of it. The jester was also the court's favorite psychological plaything. Need to test a new poison? Have the jester sample the king's wine first? Want to humiliate a visiting diplomat? Order the fool to mimic his accent until he stormed out in a rage. The jester's dignity was currency, spent freely by those who had none of their own to spare. And yet, bizarrely, some jesters thrived in this role. There was a perverse power in being the only person who could say the unsayable, even if it came with a side of bruises. A clever jester might plant ideas in the king's head by framing them as jokes, or warn of impending disasters under the guise of absurd prophecies. The best ones learned to read the room like a map, navigating the shifting alliances and unspoken grudges that made up life at court. But for every jester who played the game well, there were a dozen who didn't survive long enough to learn the rules. The castle records were full of vague entries about fools who had left service or gone on pilgrimage, phrases that usually meant they'd pushed their luck one too many times. The lucky ones were simply dismissed. The unlucky ones found themselves in the dungeons, or worse. So the next time you picture a jester capering through a medieval hall, remember this: every laugh he earned was a negotiation, every joke a gamble. He was the court's pressure valve, its whipping boy, its mirror. And like all mirrors, he was most valuable when he reflected exactly what people wanted to see. The moment he showed them something else, he was as good as broken. Chapter 3. Dancing on the Edge of the Blade. The most dangerous thing about a jester wasn't his foolishness. It was his clarity. While nobles wrapped their schemes in layers of polite fiction, and servants kept their heads bowed in silence, the jester lived in the uncomfortable space between truth and treason. He could say what others merely thought, could voice the quiet rebellion simmering beneath the surface of courtly decorum. But this privilege came at a cost. A joke that landed wrong wasn't just a failed bit of entertainment, it could be the last thing a jester ever said. Mastering this balance was an art form in itself. The best jesters understood that satire had to be sharp enough to draw blood, but never deep enough to kill. They learned to lace their barbs with just enough absurdity that a lord could pretend not to recognize himself in the caricature. A well-crafted insult, delivered with a grin and a jingle of bells, could expose a man's flaws while still letting him laugh along. But the margin for error was vanishingly small. Take the case of Guibert, known to the court of Duke Philip as the grinning viper. Guibert had a talent for political mimicry so precise that, with a tilt of his head and a slight rasp in his voice, he could conjure the image of any noble in the room. For years he walked the knife's edge, mocking the Duke's counselors just enough to amuse their rivals, but never enough to demand retribution. His most famous routine involved a puppet show where straw-stuffed effigies of the court debated which of them was the most useless. The Duke roared with laughter every time, until the night Guibert added a new puppet, a particularly dim-witted figure with the Duke's own habit of forgetting names mid-sentence. The silence that followed was the kind that made jesters reconsider their career choices. Guibert survived, but only because he had the reflexes of a man who'd spent a lifetime dodging consequences. Before the Duke could so much as frown, Guibert fell to his knees, wailing in exaggerated despair about how even his stupidest puppet was still smarter than himself. The Duke, caught between offense and vanity, chose to take it as a compliment to his own intellect. Guibert kept his head, but he also learned a valuable lesson. No one's pride was truly safe, not even when wrapped in the guise of folly. Of course, not all jesters were so lucky. The archives of medieval courts are littered with accounts of fools who misjudged their audience. In 1347, a jester in the service of Count Otto of Bavaria made the mistake of mocking the Count's failed military campaign a little too accurately. The gag itself was harmless, a bit where the jester pretended to lose a battle against a flock of geese. But the sting of truth was too much for the Count's wounded pride. The jester was stripped of his motley and hanged the next morning as a lesson in humility. The line between jest and treason was often arbitrary, drawn not by the content of the joke but by the mood of the listener. A king in good spirits might chuckle at a jester's impression of his stammer. The same king, after a bad day of petitions, might see it as a challenge to his authority. The jester's safety lay not in the words he spoke, but in his ability to read the room and pivot before the laughter turned to anger. Some jesters developed elaborate strategies to protect themselves. They couched their sharpest observations in layers of nonsense, burying the truth so deep that only the cleverest listeners would dig it out. Others relied on misdirection, following a risky joke with a self-deprecating jab to remind everyone that they were, after all, just fools. A few even cultivated alliances with powerful patrons who might intervene if a performance went sour. But the most cunning jesters of all understood the true power of their role. They were the court's scapegoats, yes, but they were also its truth-tellers. A noble who would never tolerate criticism from his peers might allow it from a fool, if only to prove he could take a joke. A wise jester could use this to plant ideas, to warn of dangers, even to sway decisions, all while maintaining the fiction that he was too simple to understand the weight of his own words. It was a dangerous game, one that required nerves of steel and a face trained to betray nothing. The jester who danced on the edge of the blade had to know exactly when to leap and when to retreat, when to draw blood and when to sheath the knife. One misstep, one moment of misjudgment, and the laughter that had protected him would vanish like smoke, leaving only the cold reality of a ruler's displeasure. And so the jester jested on, balancing truth and survival, knowing that the line between them was as thin as the edge of a blade, and just as likely to cut. Chapter 4. The food wasn't always funny. There was perhaps no greater symbol of a jester's precarious place in the medieval hierarchy than the food he ate, or more accurately, the food he didn't. While lords and ladies gorged themselves on roasted swans and sugared subtleties, the fool made do with whatever scraps the kitchen staff deemed unworthy of the high table. A jester might spend his evening provoking laughter from nobles wiping grease from their chins, only to retire to a cold corner of the hall with a bowl of lukewarm pottage, and the gnawing understanding that even the hunting dogs were often fed better than he was. The disparity was deliberate. Food in a medieval court wasn't just sustenance. It was theater, a display of wealth and power so extravagant that it bordered on the absurd. A single feast might feature a dozen courses, each more outlandish than the last. Peacocks redressed in their own feathers, pies that burst open to release live songbirds, gelatin molded into the shape of castles. The nobility gorged themselves not because they were hungry, but because they could. And the jester, perched on the edge of the spectacle, was both part of the entertainment and a living reminder of what happened to those who didn't belong at the table. Some jesters were technically permitted to dine in the hall, but their portions were carefully calculated insults. A noble might toss a half-gnawed bone in the jester's direction, laughing as the fool scrabbled to catch it. Leftover bread, hardened to the consistency of stone by the time it reached him, had to be soaked in watered-down ale to be edible. Even on fast days, when the whole court supped on fish and vegetables, the jester's portion was invariably the dregs, the fish heads, the wilted greens, the crusts of pies that had been picked clean of filling. Worse still were the jests played at the jester's expense. A lord might offer him a tempting cut of meat, only to yank it away at the last moment while the hall roared with laughter. Others took pleasure in forcing the fool to perform for his supper, demanding increasingly humiliating acts in exchange for a mouthful of food. One particularly cruel account from the court of King Louis VII describes a jester made to balance on one leg while reciting verses. Only if he could make the king laugh would he be given a slice of cheese. The king, famously humorless, rarely laughed. The kitchens, too, had their own ways of reminding the jester of his place. Cooks reserved for him the most dubious ingredients, the gristly offcuts, the vegetables that had begun to turn, the meats that had sat just a shade too long in the larder. It was not uncommon for a jester to spend the night clutching his stomach after a meal of special stew, while the nobility slept off their feasts untroubled. Some jesters learned to cultivate friendships with the scullions, trading jokes or favors for slightly less hazardous fare, but even this was a gamble. A servant caught showing kindness to the fool might find himself joining him in disgrace. And yet, for all the indignities, the jester's relationship with food wasn't entirely one-sided. A clever fool could turn the system against itself, using hunger as yet another prop in his act. A well-timed grumble about the quality of his meals might shame a noble into tossing him a better cut of meat, if only to prove his own generosity. A jester who could make the court laugh at their own gluttony might be rewarded with a trencher of something edible, if for no other reason than to keep the bit going. But these were small victories. However skilled the jester became at gaming the system, he could never truly escape the reality of his position. He was there to be laughed at, and nothing invited laughter quite like the spectacle of a hungry man begging for scraps. The nobility feasted, the jester performed, and when the last course was cleared and the wine flowed freely, no one noticed if the fool's bowl remained empty. So the next time you picture a medieval banquet, spare a thought for the jester, the one man in the hall who couldn't afford to lose his appetite, no matter how meager the fare. His hunger, like his laughter, was part of the show. Chapter 5. Sleeping with one eye open. The jester's day didn't end when the torches burned low and the drunken nobles staggered to their chambers. If anything, nighttime brought greater dangers. Daylight at least offered the pretense of rules, the thin veneer of courtly behavior that restrained the worst impulses of the nobility. But darkness stripped all that away, leaving only the raw, unfiltered threat of men with power and no witnesses. Take the sleeping arrangements themselves. While lords retired to feather beds, draped in velvet, jesters typically bedded down in whatever forgotten corner of the castle they could claim. Some were relegated to the kitchens, where they curled up near the warmth of dying hearths. Others found space in the stables, where at least the horses didn't pretend to be anything but animals. The luckiest might secure a pallet in the servants' quarters, though even this came with risks. Servants resented the fool who lived by laughter rather than labor. and many a jester woke to find his blanket mysteriously damp or his shoes missing. But the real danger came from the nobility's nocturnal whims. A drunken knight might decide it would be hilarious to wake the jester by dumping a chamber pot on his head. A group of squires, bored and restless after hours of drinking, might drag the fool from his makeshift bed for midnight entertainment that invariably involved some combination of humiliation and pain. The line between jest and assault blurred completely once the sun went down. Then there were the political dangers. Jesters often overheard things they weren't meant to, whispered conspiracies, drunken confessions, the sort of careless words that could get a man killed if the wrong person remembered them being said. A wise jester developed selective hearing and a convenient inability to recall details when questioned. The unwise ones tended to disappear during the night, their bodies found in the moat come morning with convenient explanations about drunken accidents. Some jesters took to sleeping in shifts, never allowing themselves to fall into deep slumber. Others cultivated the art of appearing asleep while remaining fully alert, a skill that saved more than one fool from a surprise knife in the dark. A few learned to barricade their sleeping nooks with whatever they could find. Overturned benches, piles of firewood, even stolen armor stands positioned to fall with a clatter at the first sign of intrusion. The most dangerous nights followed particularly successful performances. A jester who had made the court laugh uproariously at some noble's expense might reasonably fear retaliation once the audience's good humor faded with the wine. It wasn't unheard of for a duke to laugh heartily at his own caricature during dinner, only to send guards to teach the fool respect in the small hours. The best jesters kept escape routes mapped out and allies among the servants who might warn them when trouble was coming. Weather complicated matters further. Winter nights meant choosing between freezing in a drafty corner or risking the suffocating lice-ridden warmth of the servants' dormitory. Summer brought its own miseries, the castle's stonework radiating the day's heat. The air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and spoiled food, the constant buzz of insects drawn to the jester's sweat-slick skin. Either way, sleep came fitfully, if at all. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that the jester, whose entire profession revolved around bringing restful amusement to others, could never truly rest himself. Every creak of floorboards might be a threat. Every rustle of fabric could signal approaching danger. Even in sleep, his face often remained fixed in that familiar grin, the muscles trained by years of performance refusing to relax even in unconsciousness. So the jester slept lightly when he slept at all. One ear always attuned to the sounds of the castle at night, the footsteps in the corridor, the muffled laughter from the lord's chambers, the distant clank of the guard changing shifts. To survive, he had to master the art of vigilance, his rest punctuated by the same careful timing that marked his performances. The difference was that on stage a mistimed joke might earn him a beating. In the darkness, a mistimed moment of inattention could cost him his life. Morning brought no real relief, only the resetting of the cycle. The jester would rise with the servants, his body aching from another night of half-sleep, his mind already working through the day's potential dangers. He'd splash water on his face, straighten his motley, and paste on a smile before the first noble even stirred. The performance never truly ended. It merely changed venues with the rising of the sun. And so the jester carried his exhaustion like another layer of costume. The bags beneath his eyes hidden beneath grease paint, the tremble in his hands disguised as part of the act. The nobility never noticed, of course. Why would they? It was, after all, difficult to spot a man sleeping with his eyes open. Chapter 6. The Lonely Fool. The jester's isolation began the moment he put on the motley. That patchwork costume didn't just mark him as the court entertainer. It severed him from every social class in the castle hierarchy. He wasn't noble enough to sit at the high table, yet too privileged to eat with the servants. Too valuable to ignore, yet never important enough to respect. This liminal existence created a peculiar kind of solitude that followed the jester like a shadow, even in the busiest halls of the castle. Consider his relationships with the nobility. A lord might spend hours bantering with his fool, might even develop something resembling friendship, until the moment the jester overstepped. Then the mask of camaraderie would slip, revealing the cold truth. The jester existed for amusement, not companionship. The nobles laughed with him, but never as equals. They confided in him, but only because they assumed a fool wouldn't understand the significance of their words. They might praise his wit one moment and backhand him the next, all without a second thought. The servants treated him with equal ambivalence. To the kitchen staff and stable hands, the jester represented everything they resented. A man who worked with his tongue rather than his hands, who earned his bread through mockery rather than sweat. They saw his privileges, the occasional coin, the right to speak freely, and ignored his sufferings. When they did interact with him, it was often with a mix of contempt and envy, as if blaming him for his own peculiar station. This left the jester in a social purgatory. He moved through the castle like a ghost, present at every gathering yet never truly part of any. During feasts, he circulated among the tables, but couldn't linger at any one place too long. In the courtyard he might pause to watch the servants at their work, but they'd quickly find reasons to turn away. Even the dogs seemed uncertain whether to greet him or growl. The psychological toll of this isolation manifested in subtle ways. Many jesters developed the habit of talking to themselves, holding entire conversations under their breath as they moved through empty corridors. Others became obsessive observers, memorizing the minute details of court life, not just for material to use in their acts, but because watching gave them something to do during the long hours when no one would speak to them. Some took to feeding the castle's stray animals, forming bonds with creatures that at least responded with consistent affection. The few jesters who managed to find genuine connections often did so at great risk. Romantic entanglements were particularly dangerous. A dalliance with a servant could get them both whipped, while catching the eye of a noble might lead to far worse consequences. Friendships with guards or kitchen staff had to be carefully hidden, lest they be misinterpreted as conspiracies. Even conversations with visiting entertainers were monitored, as lords grew suspicious of what secrets might be exchanged between professionals. This enforced solitude bred a particular kind of melancholy that clung to even the most animated performers. The jester's laughter often rang hollow when no audience was present. His famous grin would slip the moment he turned a corner, revealing a face lined with exhaustion. The same man who could reduce a banquet hall to tears of mirth might spend his evenings staring silently at the moon through a narrow window, wondering if anyone in the castle would notice if he simply disappeared. Some jesters coped by creating elaborate inner lives. They imagined themselves as kings of invisible realms, or as spies gathering intelligence for some far-off monarch. Others developed superstitions, assigning meaning to the patterns of bird flights or the arrangement of food scraps on their plates. A few turned to religion, though even this offered little comfort. The church generally viewed jesters as morally suspect, and most priests kept their distance from men who made their living through deception and mockery. The cruelest paradox was that the jester's isolation made him a perfect confidant for everyone else's secrets. Nobles would drunkenly confess their affairs to him, assuming a fool wouldn't understand or remember. Servants would whisper their grievances, figuring he had no one to tell. Even the castle chaplain might let slip some scandal, secure in the knowledge that the jester's words carried no weight. This made him a walking repository of dangerous knowledge, each secret another weight on his already burdened shoulders. In the end, perhaps this explains why so many jesters drank heavily, why so many developed a 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much but could say nothing. They were the castle's silent witnesses, the keepers of unspoken truths, the lonely fools who saw everything and belonged nowhere. Their motley wasn't just a costume. It was a visible manifestation of their fractured existence, a patchwork of identities that never quite formed a whole. So the next time you picture a medieval jester capering before the throne, remember this: the loudest laughter often comes from the loneliest hearts. That grin might hide more sorrow than any frown could express. And those spells? They're not just for entertainment. They're a constant reminder that somewhere, someone is still there, even if no one is really listening. Chapter 7. Jesters, the original cancel culture victims. The medieval court operated under an unspoken rule. Everyone was disposable, but jesters were especially so. Their entire profession depended on the fragile whims of power, where a single ill-timed joke could transform a court favorite into a cautionary tale before the laughter had even died down. While modern comedians risk offended tweets and bad reviews, medieval fools gambled with their lives every time they opened their mouths. Consider the case of Triboulet, fool to King Francis I of France. For years he rode high on royal favor. His sharp tongue spared punishment through a combination of wit and the king's genuine affection. Then came the fateful day when he mocked a nobleman a bit too accurately about his wife's infidelities. The noble, rather than laughing along, drew his dagger and would have killed Triboulet on the spot had the king not intervened. Even royal protection had its limits, though. Francis banished Triboulet for his own safety, proving that in medieval cancel culture, exile counted as mercy. Other jesters weren't so lucky. The court of Henry VIII provides particularly gruesome examples of humor gone wrong. One unnamed fool, emboldened by wine, made the mistake of joking about the king's inability to produce a male heir. The punchline about a crown that keeps rolling to women earned him not applause, but a trip to the Tower, followed by an inventive execution involving hot irons and a very slow drop from the castle walls. The message was clear. Some subjects were too dangerous to joke about, even for a licensed fool. The precarious nature of a jester's position became especially apparent during times of political tension. A joke that might earn cheers during peacetime could be construed as treason during war. A bit mocking the French when England was at war with France might play well, unless the king was secretly negotiating a peace treaty, in which case the same joke suddenly became diplomatic sabotage. Many jesters learned this lesson the hard way, discovering that royal moods shifted faster than they could backpedal. Religious humor presented another minefield. The church maintained strict boundaries about what could be mocked, and crossing them invited not just earthly punishment but threats of eternal damnation. When Jester Roland Lefartere performed his infamous holy flatulence routine during Lent, complete with fart noises during prayers, the local bishop demanded his excommunication. Only the intervention of Roland's noble patron saved him from being burned as a heretic, though he did spend 3 months confined to the castle latrines as penance. Women jesters faced even greater risks. Female fools like Jane Fool in Henry VIII's court had to navigate not just the usual pitfalls of satire, but also the medieval world's deep discomfort with women who spoke too boldly. A man might get beaten for an offensive joke. A woman risked being branded a witch. The line between clever fool and dangerous heretic became dangerously thin when the jester in question wore skirts. Some rulers used their jesters as political scapegoats. A king wanting to test public opinion might have his fool float a controversial idea in joke form, then gauge the reaction. If the crowd responded poorly, the jester could be punished as a way to distance the crown from the sentiment. This practice became so common that experienced jesters developed techniques for ambiguous delivery, phrasing jokes so they could theoretically have multiple meanings if needed. The speed with which a jester could fall from grace was breathtaking. One day he might be the life of the feast, receiving gifts and praise. The next he could find himself in the stocks, his motley stripped away, his former admirers now tossing rotten fruit at him with equal enthusiasm to their previous applause. The most successful jesters understood that their position was inherently temporary, that today's laughter might be tomorrow's condemnation. This constant danger created a peculiar form of professional paranoia. Many jesters developed habits like always sitting near exits, cultivating friendships with guards who might warn them of impending trouble, or memorizing multiple versions of jokes so they could soften them if the audience seemed hostile. Some took to drinking heavily, both to steel their nerves for dangerous material and to blur the memories of close calls. The psychological toll manifested in various ways. Some jesters' performances grew increasingly manic, their eyes wild with barely contained panic even as they delivered their lines. Others became eerily calm, developing the detached demeanor of men who had accepted their eventual fate. A few turned their anxiety into part of the act, crafting routines about their own impending doom that somehow made audiences laugh all the harder. Perhaps the most tragic cases were the jesters who outlived their patrons. A fool whose protector died suddenly often found himself cast adrift, his institutional knowledge suddenly worthless, his style of humor no longer fashionable. Some wandered from court to court, like ghostly reminders of regimes past. Others fell into poverty, their once valuable skills now just embarrassing relics. Fortunate few managed to retire quietly, though even then they often struggled to adjust to lives where no one expected them to be funny on command. The lesson was clear. In the medieval court's brutal version of cancel culture, the audience always held absolute power. The jester danced on the edge of the blade not because he wanted to, but because that was the only place he was allowed to stand. One slip, one misjudged moment, and the performance would end, permanently. So the next time you hear about a modern comedian facing backlash, remember the jesters who came before. Their stories remind us that the price of laughter has always been high, and that the line between entertainer and target has never been as clear as we might like to think. The bells on their hats may have fallen silent, but their cautionary tales still echo through history. Chapter 8. The Dark Humor of the Plague Years. When the Black Death came to Europe, it didn't discriminate between kings and peasants, priests and thieves. But while the plague made no distinctions, human society still did, and jesters, as always, found themselves in the impossible position of making death funny. The court demanded laughter even as corpses piled in the streets, even as the wealthy barricaded themselves in their manors, even as the world outside crumbled. The jester's task became a macabre tightrope walk, to acknowledge the horror just enough to relieve the tension, but never so much that it became unbearable. It was comedy at the edge of the abyss, where the wrong joke might send everyone tumbling in. The paradox was almost cruel in its simplicity. The same nobles who paid physicians to wear those absurd beaked masks filled with herbs, who scrubbed their hands with vinegar between courses, who burned aromatic woods to purify the air, still expected their fool to arrive punctually for dinner and perform as though nothing had changed. The show, it seemed, had to go on, even if half the cast was dying. Jesters became living reminders that life persisted, their bells a defiant jingle against the silence of the grave. Some jesters leaned into the morbidity with startling creativity. One account tells of a performer who appeared at a noble's banquet wearing a costume sewn with actual plague buboes made of stuffed cloth, groaning theatrically before suddenly springing to life with a dance. The stunned silence lasted just a moment before nervous laughter broke out, the kind of laughter that walks the line between relief and hysteria. The noble, reportedly, rewarded him handsomely, as if grateful for permission to laugh at what terrified him most. Others took a different approach, satirizing the futile precautions of the wealthy. A popular bit involved jesters pretending to be doctors, waving ridiculous wooden plague wands that supposedly warded off miasma, or giving exaggerated diagnoses where every sneeze became a death sentence. The humor cut deep because it revealed an uncomfortable truth. In the face of the plague, everyone was equally powerless, no matter their status or superstitions. Of course, this meant walking a dangerous line. Mock the wrong noble's plague remedies, and you might find yourself tossed into a real plague house to test their efficacy. The psychological toll on performers was immense. Jesters who had spent years developing their craft suddenly found themselves mining humor from mass graves. Those who had once joked about harvests and marriages now crafted punchlines about quarantines and last rites. The same nobles who demanded this bleak entertainment often punished the jesters afterward, as if angry at them for exposing the absurdity they had demanded in the first place. Many fools took to drinking heavily, their performances growing increasingly unhinged as the death toll rose. Some disappeared altogether, whether from the plague itself or simply from walking away into the chaos, never to be seen again. The plague years also birthed a particularly dark subset of humor, what we might now call survivor's comedy. Jesters who outlived multiple employers developed routines about their own improbable longevity, joking that death himself found them too ridiculous to claim. Others turned their survival into a biting commentary on the randomness of the pestilence. Why was I spared? Because the plague mistook me for one of its own jokes. These bits walked a razor's edge between bravery and despair, giving voice to the unspoken question haunting every survivor. Why me? Children's deaths became an especially fraught subject. When a noble's heir succumbed, the jester was expected to walk an impossible line, acknowledge the loss enough to comfort, but never dwell on it enough to sadden. Some developed symbolic performances, using puppets or shadows to represent the cycle of life and death, allowing grieving parents to project their emotions without directly addressing them. Others employed what became known as the turn, starting a routine about childhood antics that seemed headed toward remembrance of the dead, only to pivot abruptly into absurdity, giving mourners permission to laugh without guilt. Perhaps the strangest phenomenon was how plague humor persisted even as performers died off. New jesters would arrive at castles, only to inherit the previous fool's repertoire of plague jokes along with his Motley. Bits about death and quarantine became standardized, passed down like macabre heirlooms. Some nobles reportedly preferred these second-hand jokes, as if the humor became safer when filtered through another's demise, the comedic equivalent of wearing a dead man's clothes after boiling them in vinegar. The plague eventually receded, but its mark on jesters remained. Those who survived found themselves permanently altered, their humor darker, their understanding of an audience's limits more acute. They had learned that laughter could exist even in hell, but also that hell didn't become any less hot for it. The experience left many with what we might now recognize as a medieval form of PTSD, jumping at sudden coughs in the audience, developing superstitions about certain types of jokes attracting bad luck, or growing morbidly fascinated with their own mortality. In the end, the plague years revealed an essential truth about the jester's craft. Comedy doesn't exist in spite of suffering, but because of it. The same nobles who demanded light-hearted entertainment during the darkest days weren't being hypocritical, they were human. They needed the jester not to distract from the horror, but to help them face it. And the jester, as always, obliged, even if it cost him pieces of his soul along the way. So the next time you hear someone say, "too soon," about a dark joke, remember the medieval fools who had no such luxury. For them, it was always too soon, and yet the show had to go on. Their bells kept jingling, their feet kept dancing, and their voices never stopped finding the ridiculous in the tragic, right up until the moment the plague finally silenced them too. Chapter 9. Fashion Faux Pas. The Jester's Motley. The jester's costume was never about fashion, it was about branding. Every element of that ridiculous patchwork ensemble served a singular purpose, to proclaim to every person in the castle that the wearer existed outside normal society. The Motley wasn't just clothing, it was a walking prison, a visual reminder that its occupant had willingly surrendered dignity in exchange for survival. Consider first the colors, those garish, clashing hues that made the jester visible from across a crowded hall. While nobles dressed in rich, harmonious tones that proclaimed their wealth and taste, the fool wore whatever mismatched scraps the tailor had left over. The message was clear. This person didn't merit proper fabric. Some lords took particular pleasure in selecting the most eye-watering combinations possible, forcing their jesters to wear outfits that physically pained spectators to behold. There are accounts of particularly cruel patrons deliberately pairing colors known to cause headaches or nausea, turning their fool into a literal discomfort to be around. Then came the cuts, The exaggerated colors that flopped like dog ears, the sleeves so long they dragged on the floor, the pants either absurdly baggy or distressingly tight. Every seam seemed designed to impede movement while simultaneously inviting mockery. A jester might trip over his own cuffs during a routine, much to the delight of his audience. The hats alone could constitute their own form of torture. Towering constructions of felt and wire that gave the wearer headaches, or caps with so many jingling bells that the sound followed the fool like a curse. Some jesters developed permanent neck problems from the weight of their headwear, while others suffered hearing damage from the constant chiming mere inches from their ears. The materials compounded the humiliation. While nobles wore fine silks and soft wools, jesters often found themselves clad in the cheapest fabrics available. Scratchy hemp, stiff canvas, or even repurposed grain sacks. These materials weren't just uncomfortable, they were deliberately degrading. A noble might spend more on his hunting dog's collar than the entire cost of his jester's wardrobe. Some accounts suggest certain fabrics were chosen specifically for their discomfort. Rough linens that chafed the skin, or poorly tanned leather that reeked when wet. The message was unmistakable. This person's comfort didn't matter. Perhaps most insidious was how the costume reinforced social isolation. The jester's motley marked him as neither noble nor servant, but something apart, a creature to be laughed at, not empathized with. This separation extended even to practical matters. While servants might share cast-off clothing among themselves, no one wanted a jester's hand-me-downs. When a fool died or was dismissed, his costume was often burned rather than reused, as if the motley itself had absorbed too much of his disgrace to risk contamination. The psychological impact of this enforced ridiculousness shouldn't be underestimated. Many jesters reported feeling the costume's weight, even when not wearing it. The way servants still snickered at them in the halls, how children would point and mimic their walk. Some developed physical tics from years spent compensating for restrictive garments, their bodies remembering the motions even when freed from the offending clothes. A select few jesters managed to turn this to their advantage, using their familiarity with discomfort to perform feats of flexibility or endurance that amazed their audiences, but these were exceptions. Clever fools learned to weaponize their motley. Some secretly sewed hidden pockets into their oversized sleeves to conceal food or small valuables. Others exaggerated the costume's inherent clumsiness to lower expectations before revealing surprising agility. A few even developed routines where they appeared to struggle with their own clothing, only to suddenly execute perfect tumbles or juggling acts. The visual contrast between their ridiculous appearance and genuine skill making the performance all the more impressive. The bells deserve special mention. Those cheerful jingles that signaled a jester's approach served a far darker purpose than mere decoration. They functioned as an early warning system for nobles, alerting them to the fool's presence so they could compose themselves before he entered earshot. More disturbingly, the bells made stealth impossible. A jester could never sneak up on a private conversation, nor could he ever move through the castle without announcing himself. It was the auditory equivalent of a prisoner's shackles, a constant reminder that he was always performing, even when alone. Worst of all was how the costume stripped away individuality. While nobles competed to display their wealth through ever more elaborate fashions, jesters had no such luxury. Their motley rendered them interchangeable. One fool looked much like another once the bells and patches were in place. Records show that when a favored jester died, lords would often simply hire a new one and dress him in the deceased's clothes, as if the position mattered more than the person filling it. Some jesters took to secretly personalizing their costumes, a hidden stitch pattern here, a carefully chosen patch there, as tiny acts of rebellion against their enforced anonymity. The motley's legacy persists today in ways we rarely consider. The classic jester silhouette remains shorthand for foolishness in everything from playing cards to corporate mascot. Modern clowns unknowingly echo the tradition with their exaggerated costumes and bright colors. Even the concept of dressing the fool for Halloween carries uncomfortable echoes of this history. When we don jester costumes for fun, we're recreating garments originally designed to humiliate. So the next time you see a depiction of a medieval jester in his colorful motley, look beyond the surface cheerfulness. Those patches represent poverty. Those bells signaled surveillance. That ridiculous hat was a crown of thorns by another name. The costume wasn't just what the jester wore. It was what wore him down, day after day, until sometimes even he couldn't remember the man beneath the motley. Chapter 10. The Jester's Retirement Plan. Spoiler: there wasn't one. The cruelest joke of a jester's career was the one life played on him in the end, that after decades of making others laugh, his own decline would be met with silence. There were no gold watches for medieval fools, no cozy cottages where retired jesters could reminisce about their glory days. When a jester's wit dulled or his legs could no longer tumble, he simply disappeared from court records like a bad punchline fading from memory. Aging hit just as harder than most professions. Their value depended entirely on their ability to entertain in the moment. A spry body for acrobatics, a sharp tongue for satire, a youthful face that made even the darkest jokes seem harmless. As these qualities faded, so did their protection. The same lords who had once roared at their jokes now looked through them like yesterday's news, their eyes already searching the crowd for younger, fresher fools. Some jesters tried desperately to adapt. Those known for physical comedy might transition to more verbal humor as their joints stiffened. Satirists whose edge had dulled might pivot to storytelling or music. But these were stopgap measures at best. The court wanted what it had always wanted: the visceral thrill of danger and vitality, the sense that their fool might actually break his neck for their amusement. An old jester performing watered-down versions of his old routines was like watching a sword fighter swing a butter knife. The shape was similar, but the threat was gone. The lucky ones were allowed to fade into the background, becoming something between a servant and a mascot. They might be kept on to train younger jesters or perform simple duties around the castle, their presence tolerated out of vague nostalgia. These forgotten fools often developed eccentric habits, talking to themselves, collecting odd trinkets, or holding imaginary conversations with long-dead patrons. The servants called them ghost jesters, shadows of their former selves who haunted the castle's edges like living cautionary tales. Others weren't so fortunate. Many aging jesters found themselves abruptly dismissed with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Without savings or land, they joined the ranks of wandering entertainers, moving from town to town until their act grew too pathetic even for peasant audiences. Some turned to begging, using the remnants of their routines to coax coins from passersby. A feeble handstand here, a wheezy song there. The particularly desperate might try to attach themselves to traveling caravans or mercenary companies, becoming camp followers who traded jokes for scraps. The physical toll of a lifetime in Motley made these twilight years especially grim. Jesters who had spent decades taking falls for laughs now suffered from chronic pain. Their backs bent like question marks, their knees swollen with old injuries. Those who had relied on alcohol to endure the stress often found their livers failing along with their careers. The bells that had once announced their arrival now served as a cruel reminder. Their shaking hands could no longer keep them silent even if they tried. A select few met darker fates. Jesters who knew too many court secrets might find themselves quietly eliminated when their usefulness ended. Others were cast out during times of famine or plague, deemed not worth feeding. There are scattered accounts of elderly jesters being forced to perform for their supper in literal sense, told they would eat only if they could still make the court laugh, their desperate antics growing more pathetic with each failed attempt. The rare jesters who had managed to save money, often discovered it, brought them little dignity. Wealthy fools were targets for thieves and schemers, their life savings easily stolen by unscrupulous innkeepers or false friends. Those who tried to retire to monasteries frequently found the clergy unwilling to house someone they considered morally suspect. Even in death, jesters were often denied proper burials, their bodies interred in unconsecrated ground alongside criminals and suicides. Perhaps most heartbreaking was how many aging jesters clung to their identities long after the world had moved on. Some continued wearing elements of their motley, a tattered cap here, a frayed patch there, as if hoping someone might recognize what they had been. Others practiced their routines alone in rented rooms, their audiences reduced to cracked mirrors and curious mice. A few became local curiosities, known for accosting strangers with jokes that had been stale when their grandfathers were children. The church offered little comfort in these declining years. While priests preached about the dignity of all men before God, they rarely extended that dignity to fools. An aging jester seeking solace was more likely to hear a lecture about vanity than receive actual compassion. Some particularly zealous clergy even saw their suffering as divine punishment for a life spent in frivolity. Ironically, the very skills that had sustained jesters in their prime now worked against them. A lifetime of reading rooms and adapting to moods made them acutely aware of each patronizing smile, each barely concealed wince at their attempts to entertain. They could see the calculations in people's eyes as they judged whether this old fool might still be worth a crust of bread or a corner to sleep in. Where once they had turned painful truths into comedy, now they simply lived those truths without punchlines. Occasionally, a particularly sentimental noble might pension off a favored jester, providing some meager support in recognition of past service. But these cases were as rare as they were unpredictable. One lord might gift his fool a cottage, while another would send his out into the snow with a boot print on his backside. There was no system, only caprice. In the end, the jester's fate mirrored his art, ephemeral, dependent on the whims of others, vanishing without trace when its time had passed. The castles where they had once performed stood for centuries, their walls preserving the names of kings and knights. But of the fools who had lightened those stones with laughter, little remained beyond a few scattered references in account books, payments for services rendered, then abruptly stopping. So when you picture a medieval jester in his prime, remember this epilogue waiting in the wings. That nimble body would stiffen, that quick wit would dull, and the laughter that had once seemed like air would become harder to catch than smoke. The motley that had defined him would become a shroud long before he died. And when the end finally came, more often than not, there would be no one left to laugh at the joke. Chapter 11. When the king had a bad day. Royal bad moods moved through medieval castles like storms through valleys. Everyone saw them coming, but only the jester stood directly in their path. While courtiers could make excuses to slip away, and servants knew to become invisible, the fool had no such luxury. His job required him to stay put, to weather the tempest with a grin, and to somehow turn the king's foul temper into laughter before it became his funeral pyre. The warning signs were always subtle but unmistakable to the experienced eye. A certain tightness around the king's mouth when receiving bad news. The way his fingers would drum just slightly too fast on the armrest. The particular silence that fell over the hall when he entered. Not the respectful hush of subjects greeting their sovereign, but the terrified quiet of prey, sensing a predator. These were the moments when jesters' palms grew slick with sweat beneath their bells, when they mentally reviewed every escape route and contingency plan. Because when royalty needed to vent their spleen, the court jester made for a conveniently disposable target. Physical violence was the most common outlet. Kings who would never dream of striking their advisors or knights had no such compunctions about backhanding their fools. The accounts are full of references to jesters being cuffed, kicked, or having objects hurled at them during royal tantrums. One particularly vivid record describes King John of England throwing a silver goblet at his jester's head so forcefully that the dent remained visible in the metal for years afterward, kept as a trophy by the king's stewards. Then there were the creative punishments. A jester in the court of Charles VI of France was forced to wear a hollowed-out pumpkin on his head for a month, after laughing at the wrong moment during one of the king's unstable episodes. Another, serving a German margrave, spent 3 days tied upside down from the castle walls after making a joke about the ruler's failed military campaign. The Margrave thoughtfully had a cushion placed below him, not to break his fall, but so the gathered crowd could better hear his groans when the ropes eventually slipped. Food-related humiliations were particularly popular. A jester who displeased Henry VIII might find himself strapped to a chair and force-fed disgusting concoctions until he vomited for the court's amusement. Others were made to eat from dog bowls or compete with actual hounds for scraps. The Earl of Warwick had a special trick where he would pretend to offer his jester a choice cut of meat, only to smear it across the fool's face instead, a bit that never failed to amuse his dining companions. The psychological tortures often cut deeper than the physical ones. Some rulers took pleasure in forcing their jesters to perform impossible tasks, telling them to make the court laugh without speaking, or to improvise verses praising the king's non-existent virtues. Failure meant extended time in the stocks. Success meant the bar would be set even higher next time. A particularly cruel Italian duke made his fool wear bells filled with different amounts of sand, so they would always sound slightly out of tune, a constant, jangling reminder of his inability to ever get things quite right. Timing was everything when dealing with a monarch's bad mood. An experienced jester knew that attempting humor too early might be seen as insolence, while waiting too long could read as cowardice. The safest approach was often to become the butt of the joke first, allowing the king to vent his anger through mockery before gently steering the mood toward actual comedy. This required an almost supernatural ability to read micro-expressions and body language, to sense exactly when the ruler's rage had cooled just enough to allow for levity. Some jesters developed physical tells for dangerous situations. A certain angle of the head could make blows glance off rather than connect squarely. A particular way of falling could turn a kick into something resembling a comic stumble. The best fools could make their genuine screams of pain sound like exaggerated performances, transforming their suffering into entertainment before the audience realized what was happening. Women jesters faced particular dangers when kings lost their tempers. While male fools might be beaten or humiliated, female jesters often found themselves targets of sexualized violence, groped, forcibly kissed, or worse. The records hint at these incidents through careful euphemisms, but the subtext is clear. A woman whose entire job involved being laughed at had little recourse when the laughter turned predatory. The aftermath of these royal tantrums left lasting marks. Many jesters developed permanent flinches at sudden movements. Others acquired nervous tics like endlessly adjusting their collars or tapping their fingers in specific patterns. A few turned to self-medication, drowning their trauma in whatever alcohol or herbs they could procure. The lucky ones found ways to channel their experiences into their acts, turning their survival strategies into comedy gold. Though this required walking the fine line between funny and tragic, that was a jester's permanent tightrope. Perhaps the most insidious aspect was how these incidents were reframed afterward. What we would now recognize as abuse was recorded as amusing anecdotes, the jester's suffering transformed into just another court entertainment. Chroniclers wrote about these episodes with the same light tone they used to describe feasts or tournaments, as if a man being forced to wear a donkey's head for a week was inherently hilarious rather than psychologically devastating. The sad truth was that these outbursts served an important function in the medieval power structure. By making the jester the court's designated punching bag, rulers created a safety valve for their own worst impulses. Better to take out one's rage on a disposable fool than on advisors who might retaliate or peasants who might revolt. The jester's bruises were, in their own twisted way, a form of statecraft. So the next time you read about some medieval king's famous temper, spare a thought for the fool who had to weather those storms. While history remembers the grand tantrums, the broken treaties, the rash declarations of war, it rarely notes the small daily violences absorbed by the men and women paid to turn those rages into laughter. Their job wasn't just to entertain, but to absorb, to deflect, and to somehow keep smiling as the blows kept coming. And if they did their jobs well enough, they might just live to see the king's next good day. Chapter 12. The Jester's Secret Diary. If Jesters had kept diaries, and perhaps some clever ones did, hidden beneath floorboards or sewn into mattress stuffing, the pages would have revealed a startling truth. These laughing men and women were the only sober observers in a drunken medieval world. While nobles postured and servants cowered, the jester saw everything with brutal clarity, his Motley a perfect disguise for the sharpest mind in the castle. Here, then, are the thoughts they could never speak aloud, the secret observations that would have gotten them hanged if ever discovered. The king is a child in an oversized crown. I realized this today as I watched him sulk after his hunting dogs failed to flush a stag. His lower lip protruded exactly like little Marie's when her sweetmeat was taken away, and his tantrum was similarly disproportionate. The only difference is that when Marie stamps her foot, the worst consequence is a scolding. When His Majesty does it, men go to war and villages burn. How strange that we dress our tyrants in silk and our babies in swaddling cloths, when their natures are so similar. The Queen's laughter is the most carefully constructed thing in the castle. I've mapped its patterns like an astronomer charts stars. 3 sharp barks when her husband says something foolish but powerful. A delicate titter behind her hand when Lady Isabel wears something unflattering. The rarest of all, a genuine snorting guffaw, reserved only for moments when someone else's misfortune is truly spectacular. I suspect she practices in her mirror, perfecting each variation like a musician tuning an instrument. Yesterday I caught her rehearsing a smile when she thought no one was looking. It vanished the moment she saw me, replaced by that familiar mask of regal indifference. We understand each other, she and I, both performers, both trapped. The bishop smells of rotting meat beneath his perfume. All that fasting can't disguise the decay creeping through his veins. He thinks his pious scowls intimidate me, but I've seen how his hands linger when blessing the pretty altar boys. The louder a man denounces sin, the more intimately he knows it. I proved this yesterday by telling a joke about Pharisees within his earshot. The way his jowls trembled told me everything. Now he watches me like a hawk, waiting for me to slip. Little does he know, the moment I see him near the wine cellar again, I'll have a new punchline ready. Sir Gerald fancies himself a great warrior. The peasants whose homes he burns between tournaments would disagree. Today I watched him strut about in armor so polished he could see his own reflection, which is clearly all he cares about. When he ordered me to mock his enemy's heraldry, I made sure to stumble over the names of battle formations. His smug correction gave him more pleasure than any real victory ever could. These nobles are so transparent. Tell them they're clever, and they'll forgive any insult. Tomorrow I might accidentally confuse his sword with a kitchen implement. The resulting lecture about proper weapon maintenance should keep him entertained for hours. The kitchen maids have more sense than the entire Privy Council combined. While the king's advisors debate which taxes to increase, Marta and her girls have developed an entire system of hand signals to warn each other about which nobles are in foul moods. They've catalogued every lord's drinking habits and dietary quirks with the precision of scholars. If these women ruled the kingdom, we'd have no wars, full granaries, and probably better pastries. Today I caught Marta rolling her eyes as the chamberlain lectured about proper venison preparation. In that moment I saw more true wisdom than in a year of royal decrees. I've discovered the secret to Lady Eleanor's flawless complexion, a lead-based powder that's slowly killing her. She trades years of life for daily compliments, and considers it a fair bargain. That's the court in microcosm. We all poison ourselves for pretty illusions. My poison just comes in jingle form. The castle's children are the only ones who understand my job. They laugh at the right moments, wince when something's truly cruel, and never pretend to find humor where none exists. Little Thomas especially has a gift. He sees the preparations behind my tricks, the way I palm objects or use misdirection. Yesterday he caught me practicing a new fall, and immediately understood its mechanics. There's hope in that boy's eyes. It will probably be beaten out of him by next winter. Sometimes at night when the castle sleeps, I take off my bells and sit by the window. The silence is like cool water on a burn. In these moments, I imagine another life, one where my wit earns me respect rather than ridicule, where my words carry weight beyond their ability to amuse. Then dawn comes, and with it the jingle of my accursed hat, and the fantasy dissolves, like mist. They think the Motley makes me a fool. They're wrong. It makes me free. Because when everyone assumes you're an idiot, you see everything. When they expect nothing but laughter, you can speak truths that would cost other men their tongues. I am the court's blind spot, its unobserved observer. And if sometimes my jokes carry sharper edges than they realize, well, that's the best jest of all. This morning I made the king laugh so hard he spilled his wine. What he didn't notice was how my punchline contained an exact quote from his secret meeting yesterday. The court roared. The advisor I was actually mocking turned pale, and my lord, blissfully oblivious, simply called for more drink. Perhaps this is why they really fear us jesters. Not because we're foolish, but because we prove how easy it is to hide the truth in plain sight. The greatest trick isn't making people laugh. It's making them think the laughter is all there is. The candle burns low. Tomorrow brings another performance, another dance on the edge of the blade. But for now, in this stolen moment of quiet, I can set aside the grinning mask and simply be. The secret thoughts will go back in their hiding place, safe until needed. After all, every good jester knows, the most powerful jokes are the ones you don't tell until the perfect moment. Chapter 13. The rare jester who got the last laugh. For most jesters, survival was victory enough. But a select few managed to turn the tables on their tormentors in ways that would make the gods of irony nod in appreciation. These rare fools understood that the true power of humor lay not in momentary laughter, but in the careful setting of traps that might take years to spring. Their stories shine like gold coins in a midden heap, proving that even the lowest could sometimes rise high enough to cast shadows on their so-called betters. Take the case of Rahere, jester to King Henry I of England, who somehow transformed from court fool to respected prior of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. This remarkable man spent his early career enduring the usual humiliations, being forced to perform naked for noble ladies, eating scraps from the floor, serving as the king's verbal punching bag. But Rahere had an eye for opportunity and a memory like a ledger book. When a nobleman once threw a goblet at his head during a feast, Rahere not only caught it deftly, but made a show of examining it like a jeweler before declaring it too cheap to keep, tossing it back with perfect aim into the noble's lap. The court erupted in laughter at this reversal, but Rahere was just getting started. He began quietly noting every secret told in his presence, every drunken confession and whispered affair. When the time came, he used this knowledge not for blackmail, but as currency, trading his silence for favors that accumulated slowly but surely. A bishop's indiscretion became Latin lessons. A knight's cowardice turned into fencing instruction. By the time Henry I died, Rahere had acquired enough education, connections and funds to establish one of London's great hospitals, transforming himself from court clown to revered holy man. The nobles who had once spat in his face now sought his blessings, never realizing how carefully he'd played them all. Then there was Triboulet, the legendary French fool who survived not one but two kings' reigns through sheer audacity. His most famous triumph came when he insulted Francis I's sister one too many times, prompting the king to sentence him to death. "But sire," Triboulet pleaded, "grant me the choice of how I shall die." The amused king agreed. "Then," declared the jester, "I choose to die of old age." The court's laughter won him a pardon, proving that sometimes the best defense was to make your executioner chuckle. Triboulet's successor, Brusquet, took the art of the comeback to new heights. When the notoriously vain Catherine de' Medici asked why he looked so gloomy, He replied, "I'm mourning your upcoming death, madame." As she sputtered in outrage, he quickly added, "For when beauty such as yours leaves this world, all clowns shall weep forever." The backhanded compliment saved his neck and became legendary, demonstrating how a skilled jester could insult royalty while making them beg for more. Female jesters faced greater dangers but occasionally turned the tables with spectacular results. Jane Fool, one of the few documented women fools at Henry VIII's court, managed what diplomats and cardinals could not. She openly criticized the king's marital decisions while keeping her head. Her secret? Couching her barbs in such childlike simplicity that they seemed harmless. When Henry divorced Anne of Cleves for being insufficiently attractive, Jane was heard to remark loudly, "Then surely plain women should pay less taxes, since they give men less pleasure." The king's laughter echoed through the hall, though the treasurer reportedly developed a permanent twitch. The Italian jester Gonella pulled off an even more daring feat by becoming the only man who could mock his duke without consequence. His master had proclaimed that anyone making him laugh during Lent would receive 100 gold florins. Gonella waited until Good Friday, then appeared naked, except for a single sock. "Why, what madness is this?" roared the duke. "I thought we were supposed to suffer during Lent," Gonella replied, "but seeing you trying not to laugh is torment enough for both of us." The duke's resulting guffaw filled Gonella's purse and cemented his immunity. From then on, his jests were considered acts of God. Some jester victories were quieter but no less sweet. A chronicle from Burgundy tells of a fool who endured years of abuse from a particular baron until opportunity finally came. The baron, having gambled away his fortune, was forced to serve as the duke's cupbearer, the same position from which he'd often poured wine over the jester's head. The fool made sure to accidentally bump his elbow whenever the disgraced noble passed, creating a poetic reversal that the court noted with silent approval. Perhaps the most impressive jester victory belonged to an unnamed Saxon fool, who turned his lord's cruelty back on him through sheer patience. The noble had a habit of making his jester stand in a freezing courtyard until he could make the guards laugh. After years of this, the jester secretly taught all the guards a dozen perfect jokes. The next time his punishment began, the entire garrison burst into uproarious laughter the moment he stepped outside. The bewildered noble, suspecting witchcraft but unable to prove it, never subjected him to the punishment again. These stories share a common thread. The jesters who triumphed understood their oppressors better than the oppressors understood themselves. They recognized that pride was the nobility's universal weakness, and that laughter could be weaponized with proper timing. Most importantly, they grasped the essential truth of their profession. The real fool was never the one wearing the bells. So while history remembers kings and conquerors, let us spare a thought for these rare jesters who turned the joke back on their tormentors. Their victories were small but perfect, like well-aimed needles popping bloated egos. They remind us that sometimes the greatest power lies not in crowns or swords, but in the courage to deliver the punchline everyone else is too frightened to say. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the fool gets the last laugh after all. Chapter 14. To Jester's Funeral. A joke in itself. Death was the one audience even jesters couldn't make laugh. After a lifetime spent turning pain into punchlines, their final exit was often treated with the same mockery that had defined their careers. While knights received solemn processions and nobles were laid to rest in candlelit crypts, the fool's body was typically disposed of with all the ceremony of kitchen scraps. The same lords who had roared at their jokes now chuckled at their corpses, turning even mortality into one last cruel bit. Consider the burial of Roland the Unfortunate, jester to Duke Philip of Burgundy. When Roland finally succumbed to the liver disease that had turned him yellow as his Motley, the Duke declared his funeral should match his profession. The servants buried him face down, claiming this would give him a new perspective in the afterlife. They tucked his staff between his arms like a child's toy and sewed tiny bells to his shroud. As the dirt rained down, the Duke himself quipped that Roland was finally bringing joy to Worms, prompting laughter from the gathered nobles. The grave went unmarked, its location forgotten by springtime. The church compounded this indignity. Most clergy considered jesters morally suspect at best, damned at worst. Their corpses were frequently denied sanctified ground, relegated instead to potter's fields or remote plots near crossroads. Some particularly zealous priests insisted on burying fools with their bells still attached, not as honor, but so God would recognize the sinner by his jingles on Judgment Day. The rare jesters who received Christian burials often had ironic epitaphs carved at their patron's whims. One surviving tombstone in Normandy reads, "Here lies Pierre, who made death laugh too soon." Even in decomposition, jesters provided amusement. Medieval medical schools regularly paid grave robbers for fools' corpses, believing their twisted bones held anatomical secrets about humor. A well-preserved jester skeleton could fetch double the price of a normal cadaver, with universities in Padua and Paris maintaining special collections. Some anatomy professors claimed a fool's ribs curved differently from other men's, supposedly to accommodate larger lungs for laughter. This pseudoscience merely gave educated men an excuse to snicker while dissecting society's outcasts. The disposal of a jester's possessions proved equally undignified. His motley was typically burned rather than passed on, as if the rags might carry some contagion of foolishness. The few items deemed valuable enough to save, a silver cup here, a jeweled dagger there, were redistributed among the courtiers, their origins quickly forgot. More than one noblewoman later wore a jester's bell repurposed as a charm on her girdle, blissfully unaware she was accessorizing with a dead man's humiliation. Some lords turned their fool's death into a final performance. When Raymond the Jester expired after 30 years of service, his count ordered the corpse propped up at the high table for one last feast. The decaying body was dressed in fresh motley, its stiffened fingers glued around a goblet. Courtiers took turns toasting the cadaver while pretending it responded, the macabre scene continuing until the smell forced them to enter the joke along with the jester. Women Jesters faced particularly grotesque post-mortem treatment. When Agnes the Fool died in childbirth, the local baron had her body displayed with her infant still between her legs, declaring it the only honest birth this castle's ever seen. The chapel refused to bury them together, arguing the unbaptized child would taint consecrated ground. They eventually went into the earth separately, at opposite ends of the potter's field, their shared grave marker a single worn cobblestone. Occasionally, a particularly beloved jester received marginally better treatment. Triboulet's passing was marked by an actual funeral mass, though the priest couldn't resist working the fool's old jokes into his sermon. The grave was dug unusually deep after someone remarked how Triboulet had always feared being shallow. Even in these rare cases, though, the humor undercut any real dignity. A jester's burial with honors still resembled a roast more than a requiem. The most tragic cases were the forgotten fools, those who died during plagues or famines when no one had energy for mockery. These jesters typically ended in mass graves, their motley indistinguishable from the rags of other paupers once the colors faded. No bells announced their passing, no laughter followed them underground. They simply ceased, as if their entire existence had been one long performance no one cared to remember. Perhaps the cruelest joke of all was how quickly the court moved on. A dead jester might be mentioned in passing at dinner, his best routines trotted out by nobles doing poor imitations. Within weeks a new fool would arrive, new bells would jingle through the halls, and the old one's name would fade like the echoes of last season's laughter. The cycle continued unbroken, each generation of jesters learning too late that their greatest fear wasn't death, but being forgotten as completely as if they'd never lived at all. So when you picture a medieval court's laughter, remember the silence that followed each jester's final bow. The jokes that would never be told again, the songs left unfinished, the particular way each one's bells had sounded when they moved. And then imagine that sound growing fainter each year, until even the echoes fade, and all that remains is the quiet of the grave, the one place where no jester ever had to force a smile again. Chapter 15. Why anyone would choose this life. The question lingers like the echo of fading bells. Why would any sane person willingly don the motley? The answer lies not in what the Jester's life offered, but in what it allowed them to escape. Behind every grinning fool stood a dozen stories of desperation, each more compelling than the last. The Jester's existence wasn't chosen so much as surrendered to, the least terrible option in a world that punished weakness without mercy. Consider the alternatives. For the peasant's son with a quick tongue, the options were backbreaking labor in the fields or slow starvation in the cities. The minor noble's bastard could either fade into obscurity or embrace the one role that granted access to court without requiring legitimacy. Failed scholars found in jesting the only occupation where their learning wouldn't get them branded as heretics. The Jester's motley, for all its humiliations, became a perverse kind of armor against worse fates. Political exiles made up perhaps the most fascinating contingent. A deposed lord's son might become a jester in his enemy's court, the ultimate disguise since no one suspects the fool of being dangerous. There's a record from Bohemia of a disgraced knight who spent 15 years as a jester plotting his revenge, only to realize he'd grown too fond of the man he was supposed to kill. The safety of being underestimated proved more intoxicating than vengeance. For women, the choice was starker still. A peasant girl with sharp wits could either marry some oaf twice her age or take her chances entertaining nobility. Some female jesters were actually educated women in disguise, using the role as the only outlet for their intellect. One account tells of a Spanish nun who fled her convent and spent a decade as a male jester before being discovered, not through her humor, but because she couldn't resist correcting the bishop's Latin during Mass. Then there were those who chose the motley not to escape something, but to become something greater. In an era when speaking truth to power meant losing your tongue, the jester's license allowed carefully veiled criticisms that would get anyone else hanged. Some fools saw themselves as truth-tellers in comic disguise, their antics a Trojan horse for subversive ideas. The church might silence a philosopher, but who would take a jester seriously enough to bother? The physical risks of the profession paled beside the dangers of medieval life for the unprotected. A peasant could be trampled by a noble's horse and receive no more apology than one gives for stepping on an ant. A wandering minstrel might be set upon by bandits or accused of witchcraft. But a jester, however mistreated, at least had the relative safety of castle walls and regular meals. His bruises were predictable, unlike the random violences of the outside world. Some fools were running from their own minds. The era had no concept of mental health care, but it did provide this peculiar outlet for the neurodivergent. The man who would today be diagnosed with Tourette's or ADHD could find acceptance, of a sort, as an eccentric jester. Their uncontrollable impulses became part of the act, their tics incorporated into routines. Better to be laughed at than burned as possessed. The greatest secret was that for all its horrors, the jester's life offered something rare in the medieval world: agency. However constrained, however humiliating, it was a role that required wit and skill to maintain. A good jester controlled the room more completely than any lord, his words directing laughter and anger like a maestro conducting an orchestra. That fleeting power, to make kings gasp with mirth or lords squirm with discomfort, proved addictive to those otherwise powerless. In the end, perhaps that's why the jester's bells still haunt our imagination centuries later. They represent the terrible, wonderful freedom of speaking the unspeakable, the courage to laugh when others only dare to weep, the audacity to survive on wit alone in a world that values only strength. So when you see a jester in some old painting, grinning madly beneath his ridiculous hat, remember, that's not just a fool you're looking at. That's someone who chose to turn their suffering into art. Someone who looked at all the cruel options the world offered and said, "No, I'll make my own way." The bells might have been forced upon them, but the laughter that they created themselves, and in a world as dark as theirs, that wasn't just survival. It was revolution. The candles gutter. The stories end. But if you listen very closely on quiet nights, you can still hear them. The faint, defiant jingle of bells in the darkness, reminding us that even in the worst of times, someone always finds the courage to laugh. The end duel.